So I want to start today with a question that I think has been at the forefront of our discussions and probably on your minds throughout the day. Why is it that antiquity matters to us at all? Does it matter because it's always mattered? Is it because it's somehow intrinsically valuable and so it should always matter? And I would say antiquity matters because it is flowing always into the present. It is an irrepressible source of meaning for us in the present, but what it means can never be fixed in stone. So we're always involved in this process of rethinking what it is that antiquity, classical antiquity, means to us under conditions where the constitution of that us, who is this we that's thinking about value together, is always changing, is always dynamic and heterogeneous in responding to conditions at once local and national and global. It's really only through actively rethinking what antiquity means to us that it can function not as a dead weight, but as a fluid resource for creating anew. So Michael very generously invited me and us to speak today about a project called Liquid Antiquity that shares with modern classicisms a commitment to really thinking about the relationship between the past and the present through contemporary art. Liquid Antiquity is in fact best described as a platform for radically rethinking the relationship, and I'll keep coming back to this word, between the classical and the contemporary, in really what I think was an unprecedented collaboration, a kind of messy, wild, beautiful collaboration between contemporary artists, curators, critics, art historians, classicists, political theorists, archaeologists, a whole group of people. So Liquid Antiquity began life as an exhibition without objects. It was an exhibition about antiquity that did not have any antiquities within it. Liquid Antiquity broke with the idea, the kind of founding gesture of the modern museum in Berlin and in Rome, which is to display antiquities to the public, and instead decided to take up the book as the site of an exhibition, whatever that means. And really we wanted to think about the book as a place where one could encounter not only classical antiquity, but really 2 millennia of reactions and responses to classical antiquity leading all the way up to the present day. So the idea, in short, was to make a kind of a handbook, deeply collaborative in spirit and adventurous in form for the creative and transdisciplinary work of reimagining the present and the future through the ancient past. And it was only after we made the book that we then returned to the site of the museum in the form of a video installation I'll say something about in a moment. So really it was by shifting attention from the matter of antiquity to the question of why antiquity matters that Liquid Antiquity engaged the relation itself, whatever that means, the relation itself as an object of curation, by which I mean an object of attention, an object of care, an object of imagination. So again, what does this mean? What is a book that is an exhibition? From the beginning, Liquid Antiquity was responding to a challenge to rethink the form in which antiquity can be exhibited in this particular context as art. I'm not an art historian, I'm not a curator, as you may have already guessed, and so it was a particularly interesting challenge. I'm someone who's worked on and off in the art world, but it was still not my natural habitat. When I first met Dakis Ioannou, who's the collector behind the DESTE Foundation for Contemporary Art, which made this project possible, he was really enthusiastic about a project that would put contemporary art in dialogue with classical antiquity. But he said, you know, let's make an exhibition that doesn't have any art objects in it. Let's just make this decision. The book is going to be the exhibition. And so part of what he was thinking was that would free us up, that the book could range from Dionysus in India, or what's now modern-day Pakistan, to Ottoman inscriptions on the Acropolis, to Charlemagne's tomb, to Walter Benjamin, to Charlie Ray. It could range all over the place. In a way, once you take up this kind of virtual world, it's limitless. And so there it was, this provocation, a kind of thought experiment that we took up. So these 2 things went together, the decision not to have objects and the decision then to make the subject of the exhibition the classical. And these together, these decisions demanded a kind of formal innovation, again, in this question of what curation would mean. And I came to understand this, as I've emphasized, as, again, thinking about the relation as an object of curation, care, in Greek epimeleia. The resulting book, Quae exhibition, is a terrain that's traversed by a flow of images and words and voices. So running through it is a brilliant visual essay, which is primarily the work of my co-editor, Karen Marta, and the book design team, Takaki Matsumoto and Amy Wilkins. And this visual essay moves between images of ancient art, so the famous Stela Girl with Bird, to images of contemporary art, and then images from the long history, the visual history of classicism in between. So Paul Althamer, Alison Vieira, Chris O'Feely. Oops. And the book is also structured, so it's structured by this kind of conversation between images across time, without captions, without any kind of indication. They're just in this flow of images that go back and forth. And there are two other modalities of conversation that structure the book. It includes, on the one hand, a new critical lexicon of concepts that were contributed by 27 critics, historians, scholars, and classicists. So, for example, dialogue, or neutrality by Constanze Güthenke, the archaic, which Polina had done, debt, waste, animism, pneuma, genos, metus, so there were some Greek words thrown in there, but also effacement, the sublime, a whole range of words. And these concepts were put forth as new tools for conceptualizing and reflecting on our relation, again, with antiquity. And I offered one way of mobilizing this lexicon in the essay, the title essay of the book, Liquid Antiquity, which incorporates each of the lexemes in a kind of Mad Lib sort of way. But it's really only one way of doing it. The book was really structured in an open-ended way so that the reader is invited to write their own story with these lexemes, and indeed to generate new lexemes. And when we did a workshop based on the project a couple months ago in Athens, at least one of the contributors, the wonderful poet Phoebe Yanisi, came with her own lexeme, the Chimera. The book also includes, on the other hand, 10 interviews with contemporary artists who I invited to sit down to talk with me, much as many as the artists were doing today, about how their work has engaged antiquity or thinking about the art history itself and the classical. So here's the interview with Christodoulos Panayiotou, with Paul Chan. Some of these conversations, so 6 of them in total, overflow the boundaries of the book and entered into the space of the museum in the form, finally, of a video installation, Liquid Antiquity Conversations, which was designed by the creative and architecture firm Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, based in New York. And so the exhibition, or the installation, was designed by Matthew Johnson and Liz Diller and installed at the Benaki Museum in Athens this past summer, concurrently with Documenta 14. So here, visitors' relationship with the antiquities in the Benaki is disrupted by the mediation of a conversation with an artist about their own relationship to antiquity. So there's this kind of refraction and mirroring. So here's obviously Jeff Koons and Paul Chan, Kari Upson, Asad Raza, Matthew Barney, and Paul Chan, and Urs Fischer. So the idea in all of this was to somehow create a project that would be by design fluid and unstable and dynamic. So in a word, it would be liquid. In its liquidity, Liquid Antiquity aims to resist what I call iconic classicism, which is particularly prevalent, I think, in the museum, by creating an alternative language and imagery for the classical and classicism. The idealization of Greek antiquity has been fundamental, of course, to the history of European humanism and the self-constitution of the Enlightenment and modernity. It's been central to the dream of the nation state and to the idea, the very idea of Western civilization, and especially when it's most under threat, whether that's in the Cold War, whether it's today. So it's embedded this notion of Greece in particular in the modern concept of art, and particularly in the value that we accord to art. It's an enormously powerful cultural legacy, and it's undeniably, in many respects, also a problematic one, as we've touched on today. It's bound up in histories of authoritarianism and colonialism and nationalism, fascism, and hegemonic power structures. It's a legacy classicism that's always at risk of calcifying into something that's static and immobile and fixed. And so for this reason, our care for antiquity and our caring about antiquity, no matter how precarious antiquity seems, is never innocent. If we're going to ask why the Greeks or the ancients matter, I think we have to do it strategically. We have to do it strategically in the face of the petrifaction of the classical, and we have to do it in the face of the power of the classical to petrify things. The timeless value of classicism's objects can often be so much taken for granted that these objects become sort of empty symbols of timeless value. They resist contestation over value where they should in fact become conduits for those conversations. There's a long-standing complicity between classicism and what Paul Chan has called chronological art, art on the side of historical time, measured time, also time that congeals into timelessness. So Chan instead advocates for what he calls chirological art, from the Greek word kairos, which describes the time of the opportune moment, the time of the unexpected, the time of mortality. In contrast to chronological art, chirological art embodies, Chan writes, quote, a desperate imminence, as if what is given is not good enough but will have to do. Radically contingent, he continues, the chirological evokes the vertiginous feeling of seeing something emerge by being made and unmade at the same instant. The chirological is, I would venture, liquid. So liquidity in liquid antiquity is both a formal principle and it's a conceptual framework. As a conceptual framework, liquid antiquity aims to rework cardinal sites of iconic classicism. So there are three of those: body, time, and the institution. So it takes up the classical body, sculpted in marble, as something that's hybrid and dynamic and malleable. A number of the artists who participated in the project have reworked the classical body in cloth or in wax. It also takes up the question of time, the traditional linear genealogical time of classicism is rethought as anachronistic or serial or folded in the vein of what the philosopher Michel Serres has called liquid history. And finally, against the institution of the Modern Museum, which is a site founded on the display of classical antiquities, the form of the exhibition is reworked as a vehicle for the circulation of words and ideas and voices. And the book itself circulates into communities that are unpredictable in advance. And this last point takes us back to the project as a formal experiment. The idea, I think, of liquid antiquity demands that we have to experiment with the forms by which we transmit the past and how antiquity travels through communities. For these forms that the classical takes determine the kinds of communities that we create, not only between the past and the present, but also between one another. One of the exciting things about this project has been the opportunity to experiment with these different communities and with roles. So you have artists who are talking about their own work as itself an extension of the work of art. You have scholars who are not just commenting on the work of art, but who are co-creators of a sort, who are makers of this critical lexicon that folds back in on itself. And so I think for artists sometimes, like, there's this fear of curators, oh my God, they might think they're artists, they're makers. But really, I think that what we were trying to respond to is the way that there's a much messier field in contemporary art right now, where you have artists doing performance lectures, or you have them working in archives and research, and that kind of energy can animate as well, I think, the work that might fall under scholarship. We really wanted to create this hybrid object that defied the conventions of both the art world and the academy. Something else that's crucial to the project is that even as it invites the reader in as one part of a we use this term we almost unthinkingly, and it's problematic when we talk about the classical. And so the project tries to make transparent some of the ways by which communities are constituted around the notion of the classical. So the fantasy of the classical has always been fixated on wholes that are reconstituted from fragments, which is something we've talked about today, and often those wholes are idealized objects that are seen as the rightful inheritance of a closed community, which is defined as much as by whom it doesn't include as by whom it includes. So liquid antiquity has sought to enact different kinds of wholes that can foster different kinds of communities and mobile we's, dynamic and embodied and contingent and fluid. It matters a lot to me, it's mattered to me even more that this has been a collaboration deeply rooted in Greece, especially at a moment when not just Documenta, but the debt crisis and the migration crisis has raised questions with renewed urgency about the costs of the Greek ideal and who bears those costs. And in the midst of all of that, what the promise of the return to the ancient past might still, where that promise may still have viability. So let me just finish by saying, under such conditions, it's impossible not to think what it would mean for Liquid Antiquity to travel to London, and part of the book is here. It's traveled to London, and part of the video installation will hopefully be part of the Classical Now installation. And when I ask that, we'll talk a little bit more about circulation. It's not just a question of the circulation of antiquities. What does that mean? What does it mean for objects to move from one place to another, the Elgin marbles? And it's not just about the liquidity of capital or liquid modernity and the movement of persons. I spent most of my time, and I'm almost done, talking about the realization of liquid antiquity as it has taken form in the book and in the installation, but I want to close by really emphasizing that the movement of the project to London, and even standing here talking to you about it, is itself part of this open-ended project, a protean project that's constantly trying to adapt and move into new circumstances. It's been a real privilege to be invited by Michael to take part in this opportunity to sort of open up a conversation, again, about the relationship between the classical and the contemporary. And I would just reiterate the commitment, I think, that we all have to really thinking about what that relationship is and how we talk to one another about it. I want to hand that discussion over now to my colleague and my collaborator on this project, Polina Kosmadaki, who is curator of modern and contemporary art at the Benaki Museum in Athens, and an art historian who's at work right now on a major project on Christian Zervos. And then she'll go ahead and introduce Christodoulos and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Brooke. So I will try and give the context in which the Liquid Antiquity program was realized, especially the context in Athens and at the Benaki Museum. So for the last couple of years, and especially this past summer, Greece and its classical heritage have paradoxically, for a country traditionally considered as being on the margins of Europe, occupied the forefront of the international art world due to the extension of Documenta 14 to Athens. This is one of the workshop pictures. I think Brooke was meant to go to that.
In Athens.
So here's the comment. So the most iconic institution of contemporary art left Kassel for the first time in its history in a move toward a fluid conception of time and space. The critical engagement with classical tradition was inscribed in, to quote Adam Simtic, a lesson in breaching the normative economic, political, and geographic divisions and attempting a shared experience mediated by culture, and more specifically, the contemporary art exhibition. By overcoming binaries such as past versus present and north versus south, I'll be showing some of the most classical references in works from Documenta in Athens. The Documenta team built their discourse on the opposition between the current image of Greece as a country in crisis and the classical glory of a culture considered as a cradle of European, and more specifically German, civilization, in order to address global capitalism, economic crisis, inequality, the problem of the global south, by destabilizing the very certainties of the Western cultural canon. In terms of the reception of antiquity, this program mostly corresponded to the idea that the past is not only what is already written, but also and mostly what is missing, accidentally or deliberately, from historical narratives, what has been repressed, set aside, neglected, or forgotten. Around and in Athens, as well as in Kassel, viewers engaged in forms of participatory and discursive practices to rethink what history means for a field mostly concerned with the significance of the present in an extended world community. In this light, the revision of classicism's content and role and its importance for challenging what could be called the hardcore modernist position around artistic autonomy became a very topical matter. For institutions in Athens, like the Benaki Museum or DESTE Foundation, one of the Benaki Museum's regular collaborators for contemporary art, this line of thought was anticipated with projects previous to 2017 that tried to come up with new strategies of collecting and exhibiting in order to build meaningful connections between historical periods and the contemporary in its various forms. This effort reached its peak, we could say, or is best described with the example of the exhibition Ametria, organized again with DESTE Foundation in 2015 at the Benaki Museum. In this exhibition, approximately 150 objects were selected from the Benaki collection and presented intermingled with contemporary art pieces from DESTE Foundation collection in order to refer to what artist Roberto Cuocchi describes as a diachronic principle of this measure, ametria, across all media and realms of creativity. The items presented alongside works by Urs Fischer, Cameron Jamin, Paul Chan, Jacob Julian Julkowski, Gregor Snyder, to name just a few of the artists of the collection of DESTE. So the objects associated with them from the Benaki Museum ranged from designs or topographical surveys of Athens, original antique sculptures, vases, Byzantine icons, modernist photographs, Islamic or Christian manuscripts, embroideries, etc. This measure, as a conceptual device for the curatorial project, contributed to reactivating the historical collection by viewing it through the lens of irrationality, impulse, or the unconventional. Here you can see one of the iconic associations of the show, a work with a skeleton and a mirror by Urs Fischer, and mirrored a flag of the Greek Revolution in the 19th century. Ametria was meant to be experienced above all with the senses, explore what happens before meaning occurs. The abandonment of chronological boundaries and of established classification, as well as captions, contesting the positivity of historicism, aimed to transform the presumably static collection into dynamic memory, into a tool for imagining the world otherwise. In the dim light and the narrow path of the labyrinth, which was the main architectural device and guiding principle in the exhibition, which altered the conditions of viewing, emerged accounts of bodily drives, occult practices of human nature, tales of belonging, references to mapping or the rhizomatic nature of the city, excessive or repressed sexuality, dystopic places like prisons, etc. This use of a collection insisted on its openness and fluidity and set aside the stereotypes concerning canonicity or imitability, terms that usually characterize a museum's corpus of works. And here you see another association between an antique sculpture and an image, a photograph by Nellis, the famous photographer. And here again, a photograph of Nellis, of Prometheus from the Delphic Festival in the 1930s, associated to a contemporary artwork by Yannis Varelas on the left. So Liquid Antiquity came as a natural next step in this process. In the year when the Benaki Museum's Piraeus venue hosted part of Documenta 14, we took up the challenge of realizing an exhibition in book form and introducing life-size video interviews of Jet Koons and Paul Chan in the antique galleries of the central building. The main idea was to establish a different world, a different environment in which to inscribe the classical and contemporary conjunction. I will show again some images, and produce new forms of past and present symbiosis within the museum's walls. These polychronic interpretations proposed through the book and the show were meant to change the sensorial, temporal, and spatial experience of classicism. This process went hand in hand with reflecting on new methods, new tools, new display practices, from the platforms to the videos, to the relation with the viewer who was sitting in front of the platform, but also through a disruption in the way people in the Benaki Museum are used to viewing antiquities, in order to undo the timelessness and authority attributed to the classical and the traditional museological presentation. What has been especially interesting in this kind of exercise was enacting rather than theorizing the abolition of the distance between the classical and the now, and putting forth the idea of the present as encompassing different layers of time. Through the collaborative and transdisciplinary methodology adopted in the broader Liquid Antiquity project, not only the book and exhibition, but also various ongoing workshops, such as the one Brooke talked about, we try to establish discussions rather than assertions and form creative propositions, while at the same time reconsidering not only the object, but also the subjects of classicism. Redefining the role of the artist, but also the role of the interpreter or the audience, marks the engagement with the question that contemporary art, its practice and its institutions have been struggling with for many years. The reconsideration of the boundaries between the roles of artists, curators, and viewers through tactics of reshuffling and interchanging tasks, swapping positions, and building more complex relational networks. Two key issues were then raised: the ambiguous distance and connection between theory and practice, and the notion of using knowledge or art in a performative way to address the contemporary necessity for action. How could what Boris Gross posits as the main goal of art, namely to show, expose, and exhibit modes of life, be achieved through the interpretation of classicism? For instance, the critical reception of the classical was used in the exhibition and the various workshops to articulate an opposing pole between preservation and creation, originality and multiplicity in theory and practice. The same preoccupations are investigated in the lexeme I contributed in the Liquid Antiquity book on the word of the archaic. That was my choice. It results from a research project that focuses on the significant role played by Christian Zervos, art critic and editor of Cahiers d'Art, both in redefining the importance of ancient civilizations for modern creation and in exploring paradigms from other cultures, one of which was the classical one, to reinvent modern art. The notion of the archaic as quest of origins, but also as the classicizing strategy, is put forward as the central conceptual device to study the editor's methodology in the research program I'm working for. The archaic impulse, as it was enacted in Cahiers d'Art, marked a new consciousness of present time identified with the avant-garde pursuit of the primal and the primitive. Zervos' project for an open-ended, speculative approach to Mediterranean archaic cultures aimed to discern large patterns and directions in the development of forms, to consider objects of all periods in a liquid conception of time and space, and to promote comparatism as well as the truth of lived experience in the Mediterranean culture and land. Within this project, as while developing Liquid Antiquity, I was particularly interested in the possibilities offered by the notion of the archaic as power structure, as liberating force, as means to claim the resurgence of primary instincts bearing the essence of universal creativity. And all this is expressed in Zervos' editorial work and writings. The experiential archaeology put forth by Cahiers d'Art and their editions was applied to both ancient and modern cultural production with the aim to unearth models and powers that resist evolutionism, nationalism, and yield sensoriality and free association in a multi-temporal environment. For the period between the two world wars, when classicism was often recuperated by right-wing politics, the turn to the archaic can be considered also and mainly as a strategy to resist bourgeois conservatism and destabilize the concept of historical time, according to which modern knowledge of the past was organized and constructed. This train of thought can then provoke a series of meaningful questions about what could be a similar kind of archaic impulse in today's contemporary art and exhibition production. Analogous questions come up both in Ametria and Liquid Antiquity. Would interrogating what is today the topos of ancient Mediterranean, contemporary ruins, or the recuperation of classical myths, of course, in an environment of economic crisis, migration crisis, etc., have the force to address the normative formations of modernity and reclaim otherness, minor stories, and critical geopolitical agency? For all these questions, the work of one of Liquid Antiquity's artists, Christodoulos Panayiotou, who is here with us, has been extremely relevant and very inspiring for all that I've described so far. And his works have been included in the exhibition Ametria and in Liquid Antiquity. So here's a link, I think, between both. His installation 2 days after Forever for the Cyprus Pavilion in the Venice Biennale of 2016 is totally paradigmatic of a consideration of liquid chronologies through what he calls choreography of time. The installation, comprising various works from his career that resonate with one another, is a reflection on the very substance of archaeological process as an all-powerful agent who has, for centuries, determined a relationship with the past. Christodoulos appropriates objects and techniques and associates in space traditions of different cultures and eras that are attributed new meanings to their architectural staging. Pots made according to traditional Cypriot pottery, roses of a variety created through an exchange of seeds in the 19th century, a proposed street plate for Justus Sigimundus, a Cypriot graphologist of the 19th century, stained glass windows fabricated in Murano, retired carpets from major Hollywood ceremonies, etc. In all this blurred chronology, the classical appears again in fragmentary forms. We encounter recuperated stones defined as debris by archaeologists and thrown away, archaeological findings that were brought to light and then buried anew, mosaics assembled from borrowed ancient tesserae held in storage at the Archaeological Museum in Nicosia, Cyprus. He transforms these recuperated and rejected fragments into ephemeral artworks, seeking to critically explore the role of the ready-made through the act of creation and destruction. Christodoulos destabilizes the epistemic structures of archaeology and rejects hierarchical relationships in time and space, but also between high and low objects, originals and copies. He proposes instead an archaeology of presence and approaches problems like, again, the crisis, globalization, forgery, through the deconstruction and reassembling of historical time. From the choice of the space where the show was staged, the oldest part of the Cyprus pavilion dating back to the 11th century, to the association of works clearly referencing the abuses of archaeological concealing or even destroying processes, he takes a critical position toward the question of hierarchy, value, and authenticity. In his works, Christodoulos integrates classicism in a reflective stance toward the master narratives of Western civilization by proposing simultaneous temporalities as a new foundation to a relation with history, based on difference and rupture, but also a spontaneous sense of affinity. He invests on the affective experience created by the presence of the object and its materiality, its deformation, or its poetic reconstruction in order to shatter the idea of a common past and put forth subjective and imaginative experiences of individual presence. So without further ado, I will now call Christodoulos.
Thank you, Polina. Well, Polina was so kind to introduce my practice, so I thought instead of talking about my work to read two letters. I often write letters, and these two letters are somehow relevant to the thematics of the workshop. Here we go. Dearest Carl, I have arrived safe in Lisbon, the city of endless waters and unfathomable sorrow. I shall be staying here for the next 2 weeks in a luminous apartment close to the center. It is my 4th time in Lisbon and the 3rd time I'm in the same apartment, but I still haven't learned the name of the street I live in. I still can't remember the way to the nearby central square, and I still don't know where the sun sets and where the river meets the ocean. It is one of those cities where I desire to ever remain a tourist, and gentle freeloader, a parasite even. I enjoy divagate and rambling here without purpose, with no objective. It is probably my response to the onerous emotional weight the city is saddled with. The Portuguese have a word for it, they call it saudade. This difficult to translate concept refers to an emotional state of profound nostalgia for an absent something or someone, and simultaneously carries the latent knowledge that the object of one's longing might never return. Since my walk last night along the Avenida da República, I will dare speculate that this knowledge is actually a painful certitude. Saudade is the emotion that remains after everything else is gone. A complex form of mourning for the aching pride of a long-gone empire completely foreign to Berlin's rituals of oblivion. Our visit to Dahlem last week could stand as a proof for that. I had to see it happening to actually believe it. The permanent exhibitions of the Ethnographical Museum are indeed being installed, the building closing its doors for good in the next coming months. I know now, for sure, that our visit to the museum, which I loved so much and visited so often, was my last. A haunting object is turning in my mind since then. You pointed to it as we entered the Department of Asian Arts. It is a Korean-made tea bowl, certainly commissioned by someone in Japan during the Edo period, a young Maibo possibly. Inexperienced as she was, the apprentice must have broken it one day accidentally during a tea ceremony. It was not scrubbed, however. The pieces were carefully joined back together with gold, mented using the kitsukori technique. Contrary to Western traditions of restoration, kitsukori, which literally means repair with gold, narrates both breakage and repair as distinct chapters in the history of an object and not as problems to be disguised. Thus, the fragmentation is kept visible, while the object, once put back together, acquires an added aesthetic value, its history performed in precious metal. Flatness and imperfection are central concepts in Japanese aesthetics that could translate in the West into the politics of the archaeological fragment, which, with some major differences, a certain fear, a certain violence, broken, damaged, and mutilated are the paradigms we have chosen to narrate in time past. When it comes to Japan, I like to think of the Shinto Ise shrine as another emblematic example. Built during the 4th century BCE, it has been repetitively demolished and rebuilt in regular intervals of 20 years ever since. Its archaeological value emanates, therefore, from the fact that nothing of the original remains, but a certain knowledge of the building origins, therefore, is perpetuated. The torso belvedere, with its mutilated body and contorted musculature, could stand as the Western counterexample. The mythology of its preservation in a state of perfect fragmentation was declared when Michelangelo allegedly declined an invitation by Pope Julius II to complete the statue with arms, legs, and head, stating that it was too beautiful to be altered. Through the Renaissance and Baroque periods, all the way down to Winkelmann's decisive conclusion, this statue stands as a stable reference for the aesthetics of non-finito and simultaneously remains a disturbance in times ingrained with dark desires. I visited Trieste a few years ago, arriving on the 8th of June. To my surprise, I soon discovered that I was there on the very same date in 1768, Winkelmann was assassinated in the hotel I was staying. Giovanna wanted to please me, and she booked the Winkelmann suite, a riot of kitsch fabric and gilded wood that I am sure will make Winkelmann turn in his grave. We arrived late, so I decided to stay in and ended up watching Disney's Little Mermaid on a flat screen, squeezed into the corner beside a copy of Winkelmann's famous portrait of Raphael Mengs. This improbable confluence carried with it a subtext of violent, tragic irony. In the fable, the witch says to the Little Mermaid, "Then your tail will divide and shrink until it becomes what we call on earth, what the people on earth call a pair of shapely legs. But every step you take will feel as if you were treading upon knife blades so sharp that blood must flow. I'm willing to help you, but are you willing to suffer all this?" Winkelmann was violently murdered by his alleged lover named Francesco Arcangeli, who wanted to steal the golden medals that Maria Theresa of Austria had given him on his visit to Vienna. Arcangeli was immediately arrested and judged guilty. In his confession, he pointedly notes that he spread apart Winkelmann's legs and stabbed him not only in the chest, but also lower down. He was executed soon after in a manner even more violent than the murder that he had committed. He was dismembered on a breaking wheel, an ancient capital punishment device that had long been abandoned in Trieste at the time, but was specifically restored for that case. When I saw the Belvedere torso a few days later in the Vatican, everything made sense. I could not help but connect the tragic story of the end of Winkelmann with his eloquent fascination for the mutilated ancient fragment, the mode of execution of his murderer, the Little Mermaid's dark desires for completion, and that fragmented ancient statue became intertwined in my head in a decisive nexus. But I divagate once again. Remember that this is what I enjoy doing the most in Lisbon. I just wanted to thank you, dearest friend, for inviting me to Dahlem this last time, before the museum premises are completely abandoned and its contents are moved to the Berlin Stadtschloss, the Imperial Palace, which is currently being rebuilt in central Berlin on the exact site where the Palace of the Republic used to stand. This vicious act of correction and the violent erasure of the history of the East, symptomatic to the overall management of the memory of DDR in Berlin, stands in an exact opposition to Kitsukori technique. It consists of wiping out the whole of the 20th century and entering the 21st by regressing to the 19th. Wouldn't it be amazing if this single object remained as the only exhibit of the museum in Dahlem once it has been completely emptied by its contents? A monument to what Berlin was, what it could have been, what it is, and what it will never be. The Ethnographical Museum of Dahlem will not exist, but we can still return to the nearby lake that you showed me next summer. Until soon, Christodoulos. Dearest Nicoletta, thank you for offering us your beautiful home for our stay. Both Alex and I are the most grateful. Castellorizo Bay provided the perfect backdrop for the end of the summer. What a fascinating locus of accelerated stratification. Under the water and so close to the shore lies the island's recent history of destruction and abandonment. Broken tiles and bricks, ceramic shards, glass fragments, and masses of metals. All manner of debris given over to the sea in an exercise of physical and emotional discharge. After all, the earthquakes, fires, and bombardments that littered the first half of the 20th century. I found it fascinating to snorkel around and see how the water covers everything that has been lost in the patina of oblivion, how the materials and colors become one and then nothing. This morning, I was surprised to encounter a large fragment of writing just a few meters from the shore. It looked like a note has been shredded and thrown into the bay. Someone must have wanted it forgotten, just like the debris the debris of the houses. Or was it maybe part of some personal ceremony? I could have read it then and there, as it was floating just under the surface, but I thought of bringing it into the light in order to study it better, as an archaeologist will do. Little did I know that what comes to light meets accelerated death. The paper crumpled, split, and broke into several pieces. I kept the largest fragment. The only word still clearly readable was the verb chano, which in Greek means I lose, in past tense, έχασα, I lost. With love, CP. Thank you.
All right. Sorry. What we'll do in this conversation is address a few questions that really have arisen out of the many conversations that have gone in and out of Liquid Antiquity as a project. And in a way, I want to start from the end of what we just heard and saw, and from Christodoulos' performance lecture, because one of the questions that has arisen, especially around the book, and I'm not quite sure whether to call it a book or an exhibit or an exhibition, because in a way it's all of these objects or actions. Liquid Antiquity is clearly not just a project about engagements with visual arts. It doesn't just treat them as an object. It's not about scholars discussing visual arts and receptions of antiquity in that sense, but in many ways it was an encouragement to interrogate really what scholars actually make and what they actually do, and what kind of relationship and relation, as you said, with antiquity this constitutes. And one of the questions is how both this kind of event or object and what we do, it makes a contribution to dialogue, and how this dialogue is configured and what the future of this kind of dialogue is. And a performance lecture is one way of doing it, I guess. But we raised a lot of questions also in one of the workshops, of which you saw the big panel with the diagram. Where do scholars go from here in order to make themselves more open to other forms of knowing antiquity? How does that kind of energy that comes out of the artwork also filter back and flow back into actual scholarly practice? Talk itself is, of course, one of these items. We talked and thought a lot about pedagogy, about talking situations in which classical knowledge is produced and is transmitted, which is itself a form that is actually not just a kind of strictly structured, predictable form of engagement, but is something that is endowed with choice, with care, with responsibility, with fragmentariness and openness and liquidity, because it's never closed. On the other hand, it also has a specific form and shape, whether it's a lecture, whether it's a tutorial, whether it's a conversation. And we have been thinking very hard about how we sort of capture both the kind of provisionality and liquidity of most of the actual thinking and talking and reading and writing about antiquity we do, and how that can actually be visualized, and how that can be made visible in forms and in things other than a book. And because we've done a lot of talking, but we haven't actually seen each other in about 8 weeks, I'm very curious to hear where your thinking is a couple of weeks after this exhibition, after our conversations, of how we can go forward, what forms of continuation, what forms of openness, what forms of sort of showing and telling, in a way, are available to scholars as well, to engage the questions of how the contemporary and the classical engage in their own work, and vice versa.
Well, I think one of the challenges of moving back from the book into the workshop, or the kind of the conversation, is that this is a very different setting than the settings that we've been working with around the book, and that the form of the workshop has been one that we've been tinkering with a lot. Constanze and I have been working on that for a while, but I've started to collaborate with some other artists, Isabel Lewis, Asad Raza, on thinking about how we take the kind of intimate work around a table where you really work through ideas and terms, and you saw that kind of whiteboard which accumulated words, and we circled around them and we tried to trace, okay, how can we break out of these poles that we fall into when we talk about classicism? Is the classical world like us? Is it different from us? Is there a continuity? Is there a discontinuity? Do we love the Greeks? Do we hate the Greeks? And it's easy to kind of fall into these halves. And we know that the answer is more complex. We know there's much more ambivalence. And I think that's where traversing the relation as a site for trying to imagine more words and concepts and forms of conversation that are truer to the ambivalence we feel about the ancient world, and that many of us feel about our work with it, the excitement, the joy, the anxiety, but then all of us are also very different. How do we build a common vocabulary? And I think another thing that's important about the workshop is that each one is different, and they're about the kind of collective emergence of a shared set of terms that becomes imminent to that gathering of people and specific to them. So this is the challenge. We have not actually done something like this where there's a lot of people looking at us and the lights are up here and we can't engage. We can't build that conversation because we don't have the time. We will be experimenting with a workshop that Isabel will work with in the spring. But I wonder if, I don't know if the two of you want to speak to the workshop a little bit, but I also want to make sure we leave time so that there's at least a little bit of time for dialogue, because that is I think, really key to what this project has been not not just us standing up here talking.
I could maybe add one further comment that will really help to bring your perspectives in as well. The question of the common vocabulary and the shared idiom. When we started this workshop, the shared idiom was sort of one of the terms that was floating around. And in a way, it became clear that despite all the communicability, there was also a fair amount of cross-talking, also talking at cross purposes. And the images you saw of the video installation in the Benaki, it was really intriguing because a lot of the mostly American scholars who had come to this had said they were very excited about sort of feeling this pull away from the video installation they were watching to the objects on display in the Benaki behind them. So, and most of the Greek artists who were there said what they found really exciting about the exhibition is because it was distracting them from the objects they knew anyway towards the video installation. So we had very different kinds of effect as well in which direction this pull went, and which opened real questions of the very different affective stances, the question how you can maintain a kind of shared idiom that sharing doesn't work quite so well in English. It's like sort of partager in French or teilen in German. It means dividing out, but it also means having in common. You know, how do we sustain this kind of the kind of negative capability for living with talking a shared idiom that at the same time, that is efficient and efficacious, but that may actually mean very, very different things.
Yes, I would say talking, but also doing, and speaking from the position of the mediator between maybe these two worlds, as a curator in a museum who reconciles, you know, research and objects and sometimes scholarly discussions and also production of contemporary art or of exhibitions of ancient art. I can say that taking the next step and continuing to, after these workshops or this work, to working with artists, imagining exhibitions, going back to the objects, you have a very different perspective after this exercise, and I think the artists do as well, and I can say that, and the institutions as well, it's very important, having done all that, having established this ground of to share, but also to do together. It opens very new possibilities to display objects in the collections or to use the collections even. That's what I'm always trying to encourage, not only display objects within the collections, but take the antiquities and use them in new works, and hopefully we'll be doing that soon.
Yeah. I have the feeling that also in the workshop, but here now today, we try to define the past and antiquity in a very, as a very stable idea, as an idea which, especially because it has historically been used as such, as an idea which is immobile and stable. And actually, by discussing, we discover more and more that the past is a very flexible idea. It's an idea that has served in many different periods and has applied to different ideologies. And this is, you were saying how you got a very different feedback by American scholars and the local, like Greeks. I'm Cypriot myself, so it comes with a certain set of different complications added to it. But antiquity and archaeology comes when we talk about my geography, at least, with a certain weight, a weight which is connected to the nationalistic argument, a weight which is very heavy sometimes to assume. So yeah, I would agree that by discussing we have access to different understandings and facades.
Should we open it up? Shall we open it up and take, I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience, if I can Yes, there's a question back down the aisle.
Hello. Thank you very much for all your presentation. I would like to ask about another liquid aspect of your project, which I'm very interested in, namely the reception of the Documenta exhibition. As we probably all know, it was quite ambivalent in Athens. People were unsure about what's the relationship between the peripheries, the central of the art world, what kind of, some people were describing it in terms of like art safari created by Western artists to see the poverty and so on and so on. So there were very like intense and quite at some points even radical responses to the whole event. There were some artworks being stolen. There were those like graffiti signs with turning Documenta into crapumenta. So it was quite, I would say, wild. I would like to ask whether you encountered these kinds of anxieties and how would you comment on that in relation to your own project? Thank you.
Maybe we should say that the project was not part of Documenta because of this.
Yes, I would like to clarify that. First of all, this project was parallel to Documenta, and of course we acknowledged and we followed the program of Documenta in order to, be somehow in tune with it and not responding to it, but just we were aware of it on the one hand. On the other hand, Documenta was happening at the Benike at the same time. Benike was a host institution. So, I wouldn't want to comment on all not the defense, not the accusation of Documenta, because this is really not our topic here. I think, for me, it was just, even this whole discussion that you're describing, and that there are special workshops and panels for that going on in Greece and elsewhere, so it's a discussion that goes on. But I think the interesting part concerning the classical contemporary connection was this experience both by artists, curators, and the public of the city in a very different spirit. Many of them were there because Documenta is fashionable and the game by thousands. Others were there for the parties, others were there for the contemporary art. But in any case, and there were also the regular tourists, but in any case, the experience, I think, of classicism in the land where it started was very different through the prism, or the one on the other side, and all that you're describing. So that's as far as I'd want to go.
I would just say really briefly, one of the challenges, I think, of Documenta is that it's precisely because it was such a political exhibition and put forward such a politicization of the art world and Europe and geography that they were held to a very high standard, and yet still seem to play out all of these narratives of crypto-colonialism and tourism and all of the rest. And sitting, kind of watching that from afar, on the one hand, and also really close from another hand, on the other hand, as a classicist, the response was, on the one hand, my God, like once we get into these questions, we really think about what's at stake in this relationship with antiquity and the place of Greece and all of this stuff that complicates it such that we can't just admire the classical. You want to go back to that. You want to go back and say, I want to go back to my study in Princeton and not think about it. And yet I think we live in a moment right now where we can't retreat. That language, that vocabulary, we can only not enter into a state of critique. I think that that's a dead end, that we as classicists come forward and we think the only responsible mode is to say, this is a problematic legacy, I disavow it, or this is just, I'm just going to expose to critique. The project is to make anew. is to be creative and this kind of what I would call a cosmopoetic gesture of how do we create worlds in which we can live with the classical past in ways that are nourishing to all different communities. And there will be contestation and there will be difficulty, but there will, I think, be a kind of flourishing that is healthier than the forms of flourishing that are isolated in these more idealized, protected relationships.
The problem when you try to make things new as a classicist is that you're of course bound by institutional rules, and we're bound by the clock. So we'll finish it here in a fitting cutting it short by institutional rules. Thank you very much, everyone.